Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining our session, Preparing for State Testing in 2020-21. You have challenges, we have solutions. I'm Christy Hovanetz. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at ExcelinEd, and I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator today. I've been working in state and federal education policy since 1999, and much of that time has been focused on assessment and accountability. Today, I'm joined by Steve Kromer, the president of Cambium Assessment, which was who acquired AIR assessments. And he has over 34 years of experience in the industry. Wiese Lepic is also joining us as the Senior Vice President at Pearson, who has 25 years of experience in the assessment industry. And Sandy Wiese, the Executive Vice President of Data Recognition Corporation, has over 16 years of experience. These leaders represent our nation's largest testing companies and have provided testing services in every state. Our short biographies are also provided in your session summary. As you know, state leaders must be prepared to administer statewide standards-based summative assessments in the 2021 school year. Whether in person or in a remote environment, gathering comparable and reliable information on student performance is essential to making objective policy and resource decisions. Many states are already partnering with their testing contractor to make sure customized decisions are ready and prepared for spring 2021. Today's panelists are ready to share their innovative solutions they have already developed and deployed for successful remote administration of state assessments. I'm excited to hear from our panelists how our states can overcome the frequently cited challenges of costs, test security, not having enough time to prepare, and test validity and reliability for results to show innovative solutions to make 2021 testing a reality. I'll ask each of our participants to provide a few minutes of commentary on their state of testing and their company's capabilities, and then we'll entertain questions from the attendees. Be sure to take time to type your questions into the chat for consideration by the panelists. So Steve, I'll turn it over and we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, hello and good afternoon. As Christy mentioned, I'm Steve Kromer, president of Cambium Assessment. I am glad to be here today to discuss testing options that are available to states and districts to use while students are receiving their instruction remotely, and potentially they will not be in the school full time in the spring. Some kids will be in school part days and at home part days. And so we, Cambium Assessment, have contracts in, I think, 27 states and or jurisdictions to administer, score, report, and many states help develop the test items and develop the tests themselves. These contracts are with state departments of education, and they are not limited to, but they're primarily based on Title I required assessments in reading, math, and science. States are also required to administer tests in English language proficiency and alternate assessments for students with significant cognitive disabilities. So I'd like to start by pointing out that all three of the organizations that you see on the panel today, we often work very closely together to provide support for states and in the industry. And we want to provide flexibility to states to administer tests remotely and not require that all students are physically in a school classroom setting in order to take a test. So we also all believe in the value of the data that's provided from these tests and how the results can be used by teachers and others to help improve individual student learning. And that's really what it's all about. Spring 2021 summative testing might be the most important year yet to assess our students. The data will be used in part to help educators understand the impact COVID has had on student learning loss. It will be an important data point at that time. So shortly after COVID hit, we, Cambium Assessment, realized that we needed to focus our technology staff on modifying our existing testing platform to allow for remote testing. In the states where we have contracts to do testing today, the students and the test administrators are already very familiar with our testing platform, and we wanted to retain that same look, the feel, the functionality of the testing platform, whether students were testing at home or whether they were testing in school, and the same with the test administrators. So this includes supported hardware for test administration, as well as the full breadth of accommodation for students who require it. basically the same sort of assisted technologies used by students in the classroom or at home during remote instruction. So we developed our remote testing solution to support interim, formative, and summative assessments. And our system has the flexibility for teachers or others in the school to assign tests to students and administer those tests remotely with or without a proctor. If a proctor is used, as we've thought about it, it could be the same teacher who is providing the instruction at home, or it could be other school personnel who would typically administer and deliver tests if the students were in the classroom. Thinking in terms of familiarity with the systems and the students. So our built-in remote proctoring feature uses the camera on the computer device that the student is using to take the test. And that camera links that their student computer to the proctor computer. There then would be a proctor panel. And that panel has the functionality for, I'm going to say the teacher to see all the students that are taking the test at that time in that session, or see an individual student if that's what they chose to do. And the proctor is able to communicate with all of the students taking the test at the same time in sort of a broadcast fashion, or communicate individually with one student at a time. And that can be accomplished through either voice or through text messaging. We think about it as the same way or a similar way that the teacher is providing instruction at home today. So, and again, the use of the camera is really a policy decision that needs to be made. It's not a decision that is made by us. It's completely an option to use the camera or not. In addition, our secure browser, we use that when we test kids in school in the past. The secure browser is used to lock down a student's desktop so that a student cannot navigate away from the test session to other applications on their computer. They're not able to go out to the internet and search. So the student desktop, like I say, becomes locked down at that point. And this is, again, an option. The secure browser does not have to be used during a test administration, but it is an option. And again, this is up to each individual teacher, and or it's up to a policy to make these kinds of decisions. So again, tests can be administered with or without a proctor. Tests can be timed or untimed. They can be scheduled to happen during an exact time frame. Or over a period of time. So it's all configurable. If it's a test where you want all the kids to start exactly at 1 p.m., just as you would in a classroom setting and last for an hour, that can all be scheduled and configured in advance. So administration, again, can happen using our built-in remote proctoring feature, or proctors, states could choose to administer tests using third-party applications such as Zoom. And again, that's a policy decision. And we wanted to make sure that the students have the same embedded accommodations that they have if they were testing in the school or instruction at home. So far this year, we've administered about 150,000 tests remotely in 4 different states. And I can tell you, because I checked again this morning with our help desk, that we have virtually received 0 help desk calls. The only calls around, is the student registered properly? It has nothing to do with the technology. And so I find that very reassuring. So costs, contracts, costs to deploy and administer tests remotely are basically cost neutral when you compare that with administering the same tests in the school. So that's an important element as well. And with that, I thank you. I'll turn it back to Christy and look forward to Q&A later.
Thanks, Steve. It sounds like you all have definitely got a move on testing some of these remote testing capabilities. Well, what if a state hasn't actually talked to their test vendor yet or talked about doing an online or a remote administration? Is there still time for them to get prepared to administer in spring 2021?
Yes, there is. And so, the way I talked about it with my company and my employees, they had all kinds of concerns. And I said, there are certain policy issues that we can't influence. But what we can do is make sure that we build a system that is ready, that when remote testing becomes I'm going to say a requirement or a necessity, that in fact we can deploy that. So because we are using the same platform, it's highly configurable. Certainly there's a small configuration that would need to take place, but the timing is not an issue. It is not too late at all. We have met with every one of our clients and have demonstrated, given them demos on how the system works so that they're all very familiar, but it is not too late.
Thanks, Steve. Sandy, want to give us a little preview on what's happened over at DRC?
Sure. Just like Cambium and Pearson, we are delivering remote tests currently and plan to deliver them if needed for the statewide summative tests. We're delivering interim assessments remotely in several of our client states. We're delivering high stakes English learner assessments across several states, including the state of Texas. And we're also administering remote tests for adult education students. So those are kids who dropped out of high school early or are in correctional facilities. And we're delivering remote tests round the clock in those facilities. We understand that teachers and students are having some struggles with remote learning. So at DRC right now, we're really focused on building supports and innovations to make remote testing as easy as possible for the student or for the teacher. And some examples of that are just like a test coordinator would go into a classroom and check to make sure all the computers are ready for testing. We've developed a device check that a student can go on and make sure that whatever device they're working can work with the test, and it won't, be a hard setup, that they're all ready to go when it's time to test. What we're trying to do is take some of the nerves and fears out of testing for both the student and the teacher. We've also developed a remote proctoring progress monitoring tool where a teacher can check to see where her students are during the time period they're testing, or a testing coordinator or school personnel could do the same. So they can tell if there's a student in the classroom who's inactive or who's exited or who is struggling to get onto the system and offer some additional help. Some unique things we're finding with remote testing is we used to have 2 peaks in our testing data each year in our 21 client states, and that was typically around 9 and somewhere between 12:30 and 1 p.m. We're seeing now with remote testing, mainly for interims, a large peak at 7 p.m. So some things change with remote testing, and we're developing innovations to address all those different needs. So with the 3rd peak in testing, we've put more customer service staff on. We have our program managers on board and ready should anything be needed at that 7 p.m. peak time. As I mentioned, we do a lot of testing with English language learners. We're a partner with the Wiese Consortia, which administers English language tests in 41 states. And we also have a product called LostLinks that's used by many large districts and states. We found that English language learners, most of the recent studies show that they've been disproportionately impacted by school closures and COVID-19. And so we're working quickly to try to help those students keep up. And so we have the capability to do remote testing with English language learners, which is a little different than just remote testing for your regular classroom. It raises additional challenges with the listening and speaking domains of needing your microphone in your computer working to pick up what you're saying. And so we've done a lot of work around those different options for computers, the microphones that are already embedded in computers that our students use. We've also learned with English language learners that if we put out written manuals or guidance or informational sheets, a Spanish-speaking student might not read the same version of Spanish as one of their fellow students. And so we've created little video clips that are spoken Spanish in standard Spanish, so that if a student can't read in the version that is put out in the guidance, they can listen to a video clip, or their parent could listen to a video clip to learn more about the testing. Also, with our English language learners, we've been using different forms for remote testing than we use for in-classroom testing. And they're equated forms, so they're comparable, but the real advantage is we'll be able to tell if there's a difference in how students are doing with remote testing or classroom testing with English language learners who sometimes have very limited access to technology and don't have this same background in using technology. So overall, we're trying to innovate and build supports for remote testing. Like the other companies, we can do remote testing. We're just trying to make it as smooth and easy as possible. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Andy. So I'm Lisa, Senior Vice President, K through 12 assessment business in the United States, focused on assessments of learning. I've been in the industry for over 25 years, and I have to say I'm amazed at the value assessments have provided, not just for measuring learning, but also making sure that kids are getting the right levels of support. I have so many stories that I'd love to share in another forum on how assessments have made a difference for kids. Like Cambium and DRC, Pearson also supports a large number of state departments of education as a prime or a subcontractor. In preparation for this spring, we've been working with our state customers to refine assessment solutions to better meet the needs of parents, teachers, and most importantly, children in this current environment. Our primary solution is to assess kids where they are. As John King and George W. Bush pointed out this morning, we don't know where children are going to be this spring. They might be at home, they might be at school, they could be in community centers, churches, at their grandparents' houses. So we need to provide nimble assessment delivery solutions to meet this need, and we're prepared to do so. Testing doesn't need to be done in schools, but can be done remotely. Pearson, just like Cambium and DRC, we have assessment solutions that can be provided remotely. We're working independently, and also we're working as an industry together to provide solutions for students with unique needs. So students with disabilities, I think Steve pointed this out earlier, they do need additional support. So our technology platform enables the utilization of assistive technology that's being used in the classrooms. After all, it makes sense for kids to use the same technology with which they're familiar with when they assess. That gives them more of an authentic test environment. Those can be delivered in the school in one-on-one settings, or they can also be delivered at home with parental support. We've also been talking to states about other solutions to make assessments more viable in the current environment this spring. So we've been looking at shortening tests. I think John King pointed that out this morning. He talked about what California was doing, testing essential skills, maybe removing field test items that don't count towards a student's score. We've also talked to our customers about expanding the test window. So if they do choose to test in schools, they can test kids in smaller groups. We've also added additional technology support, like Sandy pointed out. And we're working with states to build enhanced communication. So my daughter took a test this past spring. And so as a parent, I went to a forum with the school where they talked about testing protocols and how we needed to test the technology and the infrastructure, our bandwidth in advance of testing, so that we wouldn't have technical issues during the test. We've also been working with our state customers to provide a forum for parents and teachers so that they can better understand why we want to test and how those results are going to be used and how they're not going to be used. The other thing that we've done at Pearson is we've recently hired a senior equity advisor. Our senior equity advisor is reviewing our testing protocols to make sure that the needs of all students are being met for test administration. Some of these are new challenges that since not all children are going to be in schools, new challenges tied to the student's home or maybe the environment at which they'll be testing. So those are protocols that we are talking about with our customers to make sure that every child has a chance to test. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to you, Christy.
Thanks so much, Lisa. So what I've heard so far from the three of you is not only is remote testing possible, it's actually happening already in a lot of states, and that's really encouraging. We do have a question right now in the chat from Matthew Wicks that says he's hearing assessment providers are prepared to offer the assessment remotely, but what states, if any, are prepared to allow for this option for the federally mandated ESSA assessments this spring?
Yeah, so let me start. I guess it's difficult for me and probably all of us to talk about sort of where states are in terms of discussions they're having internally. It's kind of up for the state to decide when they might announce what they're going to do. I know we've been in discussions with states and various consortia who are looking at revising their tests to be shorter, as we've talked about, looking to have and use only maybe one fixed form rather than multiple forms to help with item exposure, or potentially if they're giving a computer adaptive test, only using half of the number of items. So there's a lot of for the shortened test. So there's a lot of discussion going on, but I think until a state kind of comes out and states what it's going to do, it would be wrong for us to probably preempt those discussions.
I do want to add, Christy, that there was a public announcement made by the state of Minnesota that they're going to offer remote testing as a backup option this spring.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, I did see that. That's very exciting for the state. We have another question from Stanley Shower. He's wondering, have there been any recent studies documenting the comparability of remote and in-person test scores?
Not that I'm aware of. We just haven't had enough data at the moment to look at K-12 remote testing to do a comparability study at this point. But we certainly anticipate that that'll be one of the top questions for the psychometricians to noodle around on and work on once we get through this next spring.
Yeah, but that is also like with online testing. We used to always test every child on paper, and then we moved to online. And once we started doing the online testing, we did a lot of comparability studies for online. That'll be the same with the remote testing. Now that we're doing remote testing, we're going to get the data and we'll do the comparability studies. Once we do those studies, then we can draw some conclusions as to whether remote learning is the same as in-person learning. So I'm excited to see the results of those.
And I think all three companies have the ability on their systems to tell whether a student took a test in the classroom, accessing the test that way, or through a secure browser, other source. So we'll be able to tell.
Great. So I'm hearing a lot about this, and it sounds like you have a lot of really great innovative technologies, a lot of new and different things that can be deployed in order to make this year successful. And Steve, I heard in your comments right away that you said, this shouldn't be a financial burden to states. That's not what we're hearing from the states. Can you explain a little bit more about what actually has to happen, or what costs would maybe be involved if a state were to pursue a remote testing option?
Yeah, so it probably varies. I mean, between the various companies even that are here on this table, but we've thought about it as not wanting to have costs be the impediment for moving remote. Certainly we've heard some states talk about not really wanting to spend the money this next year for testing, whether it's remote or in the class or in the schools. So I've heard more around that. And I think from our perspective, we've spent a lot of time, money, and dollars to develop our system, but we're not looking to cost recover that as a part of like some kind of, okay, for every kid that you're going to test, you got to add some amount of money. So for us, it's basically cost neutral. You got to remember too that these are very large testing programs that we have and we administer. So it's not like, these are $1 million or $2 million programs. They're much more than that when we think about not just the test administration, but all of the item development, the field testing, the psychometric work, everything that goes into sustaining these programs long term.
Another cost, though, Christy, remember, is the cost of the devices and also the bandwidth and the internet. But those are costs that will need to be incurred regardless of whether you do remote testing, because many kids are learning from home, and those are costs that will need to be covered anyway.
Okay.
And I would just add, there may be some additional guidance materials or things if a state makes a decision late in the game, but very small compared, we won't be passing on the costs of making our system remote ready.
Okay, thanks. We've also heard a lot about test security, and each of you hinted at that in your comments. But there are a lot of questions around that, both on the administration side about how do we know that students are taking a secure administration, that we know it's the student taking the test, that they're not getting outside help. But then also on the other side of it, because tests are kind of expensive to develop, how or are there any measures to ensure that items aren't shared or distributed or published? So kind of looking at both sides of the angle here during the administration and then after the administration too, and what you all are doing to help with test security.
Okay, I'll go. So one thing we're doing is, like I said, using the secure browser. So if it is a secure test and we're worried about item test security, the secure browser, does not allow a student to take a copy of a test question and print that or store it or do anything else with it. In addition, if the video, the cameras are turned on, and you think about a proctor teacher administering a test to, let's say, 30 kids, whatever that might be, there's an observation component that is happening as well. So that proctor can look to see if it looks like some kind of test irregularity might be happening, or there's some kind of interference, and can then have a one-on-one discussion with that student at that time. In addition to that, there certainly are protocols in the industry to look for test questions that might end up out on the internet, either during the actual test administration or post the administration, to determine whether any test question or item has been breached in some fashion. And I would anticipate the same here. Also, I mentioned that some of our state clients are looking at minimizing the number of items that they might administer remotely. And doing such, you would then have, less of an impact on some type of item breach. Or states that use a computer adaptive test. In those cases, there are so many items in an item bank that, even if you have a small item breach of an item or so, it isn't as impactive on the entire item bank available to that state.
So Steve did a great job covering that. I just want to add a couple more things, Steve, to what you commented on. As I mentioned before, when my daughter took a test this past spring, the school gave a presentation for the parents on the testing protocols. And so, again, I think by doing that, then the parents understand to take the cell phone, if the child has a cell phone, out of the room, so the child doesn't have the opportunity to take a picture with their cell phone. There also might be, some states have been using maybe a different form for the remote testing, or they might be using some other items from last year maybe that they didn't utilize. The other thing, as I mentioned too, is also being really clear with the parents, the students, and the teachers on how the results are going to be used and how they're not going to be used. So if they're going to be used in a way that benefits the child based on the test results, like maybe you get put into a special program, or maybe you're going to get additional assistance, then that actually removes the motivation to cheat. So I think those are some other ways that we can enhance test security.
And just adding to what Steve said, we all have teams of psychometricians and research experts who look at each question and look for test irregularities. So there will be an analysis done to look to see if possibly there was a breach of any item.
Okay. So I'm also reading a lot in the media about, oh, test results this year just aren't going to be valid, or they're not going to be comparable to other years. Can you explain to me what it means for a test result to be valid? And how would we know they're not going to be valid this year at this point? And what are some of the measures you're taking to ensure that we do have a valid and reliable administration this year?
So I can start with that one. We're working hard to make sure that we do get both meaningful and valid results. And part of having valid results is having the right student population taking the test. And so our efforts at remote learning, if needed, remote testing, if needed, is part of that plan to make sure we get valid results. Also, we'll be doing a lot of psychometric review to bridge the gap year where we did not have data from spring of last year.
Plus, I think the results will be different than they were in previous years. Just we're in a completely different environment. Obviously, we can't compare them to last year because there wasn't any data last year. But I think that the first step is to have the data, and then we can review the validity of the data. But I think, as Sandy pointed out, we have many methods by which to do that.
Right, and I think it would be, not the right assumption to start by thinking the data will not be valid, so let's just not do any testing. Certainly, there will be, as individual students take these tests, and there will be data available for those individual students that will in fact be valid and will help teachers improve instruction for those kids and identify, what weaknesses they might have. So I would say that data will be valid. And at the same time, when you think about the magnitude of the number of kids in a grade level who take a test, and then you look at the aggregate scores of a large population like that, that's significant in terms of, if there is a small number of, test irregularities or whatever it is that's causing people to think the data might not be valid, then, I think they get kind of thrown out. And certainly psychometricians can look at that at the impact analysis of the data.
Yeah. Plus, just think of all the articles you've read about the fact that the learning gap the achievement gap is growing. It would be great to have data to show that. So we know, okay, we actually have evidence of this, and now let's actually take steps to change this.
And I would add that in addition to identifying, as Steve said, where a student is at in their level of achievement or their strengths or needs, this statewide data is going to be really critical for addressing equity issues that are resulting from COVID or school closures or technology differences. So it's going to be needed for a lot of purposes. It might not be the same as it was.
And so this is the question that keeps giving, Christy. So that's another important point, Sandy, just the fact that by having that state level data to see how the instructional programs have been, any variability in instructional programs across districts, I think that's going to be really important. So if two districts have a hybrid model, but they're implementing that hybrid model in a different way, I think the data will be really important to show which of the models is more effective.
And just on a practical example, one of my colleagues at work here at DRC was saying, my son is doing remote learning and has been for several months. I see him on the computer every day, and I think he's learning. I think he's making progress, but I really don't know. And so I will want to know, has he learned and where is he at come spring?
Great. We have another question from Matthew Wicks. He wants to know if you have any insights on how states will handle growth measures this year, given that there wasn't testing in 2019-2020.
Excellent question. I'm not sure that I have that insight. And I think, again, this is going to be a matter of a lot of post-analyses that are going to need to happen in order to determine what the impact might be and how they look at growth and growth measures when we had sort of a gap year last year. Certainly, I think a lot of us probably believe that we need to think about policy decisions around, the regulations that might be used to, I'm going to say that the nature of the test, high stakes nature, how that data is used. We don't want it to be punitive as it has been in the past. I think, it's not something that we all have a good handle on right now, but maybe Sandy and Lisa have had discussions around clients specifically regarding this question.
Yeah, and I think really the most important thing with the data is to get it in the hands of the parents and teachers right away, as quickly as possible. And then I think it will be answering all the questions about how we're going to leverage that data, what the studies we're going to do. I think that is the second most important thing.
And as a follow-up to what Lisa just said, we are in discussion with several of our states about issuing preliminary results so students and teachers get their data very quickly. And then some of this additional review or studies can come later. But to provide the data and get meaningful information to teachers in schools right away or parents, we view as critical, and states are interested in those options.
Okay. Thanks. Cindy Williams wants to know, given that the testing companies are offering to turn around the data quickly so parents can have the info to go into the summer, is there any thought on being given to reporting data in a way that is meaningful to parents? Full disclosure that this is a self-serving question, as Learning Heroes does this work with state leaders.
Cindy, definitely. That is, since this data is definitely going to be used by parents right away and teachers, we want to make sure that it is in a usable format. If you have any ideas on how to do that, Sandy, Stephen, I would love to hear them. So feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to connect. But definitely, I think that is something that we need to look at, and we've been talking to our state customers about.
Okay, we have another question from Seth Rao. He wants to know, what percentage of kids do you think need to take the state assessments for them to be seen as valid for the upcoming years? It seems like most states are going to ask for federal waivers from the 95% participation requirement.
I don't think, from our vantage points, our states and our research teams have decided that there's 8% needed.
Same here. I don't think we've addressed that yet. We'll definitely work with the state and their technical advisory committee to make that decision.
Right, the same. And again, we're talking about valid at what level, what aggregate level? So if we think about valid for an individual student and a teacher looks at that result and feels like that result is indicative of kind of that student's abilities, then I think that data is very valid. If you see highly discrepant information, then maybe that's different. But from an individual student level, I think the validity is going to be there. Thinking about at the large group level, I agree. Technical advisory committees, will help answer that question.
And I think that's an important point is that Steve's making is, even if we don't have 95% of students tested in a state or 95% of each of the independent student groups, that we're still getting information about individual students and even whole groups of schools and districts that'll be able to help provide policy decisions and resource decisions and student instructional decisions from those educators. So even if we don't have 95% tested across the state, we are still getting a lot of valuable information about student progress, even if we might not be able to aggregate and generalize it for the entire population of the students.
I do want to make clear, though, that we are looking at ways to try to test all students. So even though we might not achieve 100% participation, it is our goal.
And I would add that that's one of the advantages of statewide testing. You're starting to see Some companies come out with reports on learning loss based on interim assessments that were taken this fall. They do point out that they're missing some large urban areas or they're missing pockets of districts. The advantages of the statewide summative test is you get data from all the districts in the state. It might not be above the 95, it might not be 100%, but you're going to have a full statewide data pool rather than individual district data.
So another question we have is with respect to reporting results. We know that tests are going to be administered remotely. In a lot of cases, states are going to be expanding their test window or pushing it later in the school year. Some states have items that are traditionally hand scored that take a long time to turn around. Other states have a lot of psychometric work they do at their state department and don't release it till the fall. What are some things states can do to expedite the reporting and scoring and make sure that this information comes back in a usable time frame for them to be prepared for the following year?
So one thing that we have states starting to do that they haven't done in the past is we have the option of having some of the hand scoring done of constructed response items. We've done quite a bit of it at centers across the country, 14 scoring centers. We also have the ability to do remote scoring of answers, which sometimes speeds up getting those answers back. So states are looking at different options on how to make sure the results come back faster.
So another way too is instead of using humans to score, we've been doing AI scoring on assessment items. Some states have been removing their open-ended responses. Other states are using pre-equated forms so that reduces some of the work that needs to be done at the back end. And then the other thing that states are looking at doing is releasing results before every student finishes the testing. So that way the results can be available, within a few days after the student tests.
Great. So we've had a lot of real technical questions, and it sounds like the technical capacity is there to be able to do remote testing this spring in a valid and reliable, secure way. Can you just give us your thoughts on why a state should test this spring?
Did you say should? Yes.
Should test this spring?
Okay. Yeah, I wonder too. So should, could, would, yeah.
Should. How should they do it?
So definitely, just as a parent, my daughter didn't take the state test this past spring, and I worry about where she's at with her learning. I don't know. I mean, what happened was she left for spring break. She never went back to school, and there were weeks where she didn't have any instruction, and then they started instruction again, and they gave one homework assignment a week. Well, she used to have one homework assignment a day, and so as a parent, I worry about what did she not learn this past spring. Now there's fall. I have no idea. Like, is she struggling? Is she not? Is the grading the same as it was before COVID? I just don't know. And so for me as a parent, I think I want to know where my daughter's at and if she's on track.
Right. I mean, I agree. 2 years off would be a problem. In addition to that, I mean, because we've had an opportunity as an industry to prepare, if you would have asked us last year, can we turn on a dime and test kids remotely in 2 weeks from then? Well, probably not effectively, but now we can. So the fact that we have remote testing as a viable option, I think that's another reason why we should be looking to test kids, not just in terms of results, but in terms of capacity and capability.
And if I could add, in addition to what Lisa and Steve said, assessment data and results are often used to make policy decisions by states, by school districts, by individual schools as to where they need to put their resources, what they need to focus on, what groups of kids are facing challenges and need extra support. So it's kind of providing that information to the policymakers or the districts or schools. That's also important. You know, we always think about, I want to know where my child is at, or parents wanting to know, but also our policymakers need to know where they're at and how to go from here to move the ball forward.
And then one last thing that I wanted to end on is really the equity issue. We want to know which kids are struggling with this change in learning and change in learning environment, and how do we help those children? Because we want to make sure everybody can get a job, they can be contributing members of society, they can lead a good life. And if we don't test for 2 years, then we could have a huge problem on our hands that kids are not going to recover from. So as I think John King said this in his presentation this morning, that we have a huge opportunity to leverage this assessment data and drive change. And so I think that's the next step. Is we need to figure out, now that we have the data, what are we going to do with it, and what changes are we going to make?
Yeah, excellent point. And really what you're saying as well is that there are populations of kids who are probably struggling more with their ability to effectively learn remotely. And I think, the assessment can help point out when you start disaggregating the data in ways that allow to see how students of certain populations are doing. I think, that will also help understand where money and financial support needs to go to help ensure that those populations of kids don't fall farther behind.
And I would add, in many of our client states, the state departments of ed have been very concerned about the kids who have never logged on or who have very limited access to technology or Wi-Fi or bandwidth, and trying to make sure that those kids get assistance for gaps that they've had. This data will help you find out where those gaps have been.
Great. Thanks. So bringing up another topic, we know it's really important to administer the state test and get information back. We heard last week that the federal government has decided to postpone the 2021 administration of the National Assessment for Educational Progress, or NAEP, which is administered in grades 4 and 8, reading and math. This is a really big decision for them, as it's been administered every other year since the implementation of No Child Left Behind to all states, and prior to that as a voluntary assessment to see how we're doing nationally. There's a big difference between NAEP and state testing and what we get from those results. We've been hearing a lot of states saying, well, if NAEP can't do it and the federal government can't do it, why should we have to do it? And I just wanted to take a minute or two to run through some of the reasons why a state would still want to test, even if we're not NAEP testing, and then hear from the three of you what your thoughts are on it. But first, just to make the difference between the NAEP test and the state test. The NAEP test is an biannual external check that just provides a generalized information about student achievement across the states. So it is our only comparable measure from state to state on how students are performing. The NAEP is not administered to all students. It's administered to a sample of students, and those sample of students don't even take the full administration of a test. So that means parents aren't getting results for NAEP, schools aren't getting results for NAEP, and most districts aren't getting results for NAEP. So we don't really have individual student level information from NAEP like we would from a state test to actually help move instruction to make school level decisions, leadership decisions, and district level decisions. We also know that NAEP is administered by the federal government and federal employees who actually deploy into a school, set up their own computers, their own hardware, and have their own proctors and select out their sample of students to take the test. This test would be given in late January or early February, as it is every other year, which is just a short 2 months from now, making it really challenging with our current COVID pandemic. NAEP results really aren't used for state level policy decisions. They're a really good comparison tool, and they're definitely a gold standard for state to state comparisons and longitudinal state comparisons, but they don't give you the information to make teacher placement decisions, professional development decisions, decisions about school leadership or instructional materials, where to deploy resources, where to provide technical assistance or extra support, or how to set up a classroom. So even if we don't have the NAEP administration this year, states shouldn't be using that as an excuse not to test statewide using their state assessments. I just want to hear what some of your thoughts are on the value of state testing data compared to what we would glean from NAEP, and why should a state continue with state testing and not be trying to request a waiver just simply because NAEP isn't being administered this year?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. A couple of the points that you made, I just want to expand upon. States actually have more flexibility on how to administer their assessments than with NAEP. And so we talked about the remote, they could test in schools. So there's a lot of different ways that they can assess. States also have control over their test administrations when schools administer the tests. That is not, there's no control that states have over the NAEP test. Also, I think the use of the data, as you talked about, NAEP is looking at trends across the states and trends in comparison with the US and other countries, but states can use the data to assess to review the COVID impact on how their kids are learning, and also how those instructional models are different across districts and how those instructional models are being implemented differently. And then also, as we mentioned, it is a powerful lever for equity. The fact that they can look at the data, they can disaggregate the data by subgroup and see how different groups of students are performing, and then use that data to develop new policies or new programs to provide additional support to those populations. I think those are all powerful ways the state summative assessment is different from the NAEP assessment.
Right.
If I can just,
go ahead.
If I can just expand upon just the difference in the logistics. So for NAEP, they come in, they bring computers into the classroom, and they're bringing a third party into the classroom for health purposes and safety purposes. That's very different than our state tests, where we're delivering and administering the tests on the computers that the students are already at, that are already in the classroom, and it's being done by teachers and test coordinators that are part of the school. So it's just adds a new burden that you don't have with state assessments.
So great summary. Not much more I could add other than I would say also the fact that it is only grade 4 and 8. It is only reading and math. There are no individual student results. And all of that helps drive kind of everything that Lisa talked about in terms of policy decisions and educational support materials. You're not going to get that from NAEP. And I think that each state has, as you said, an opportunity now to continue to test and think about remote testing, where NAEP is not a possibility.
Thanks. So as we're winding down our session here, what I've heard and can take away as a session summary is technically, it is absolutely possible to administer assessments this spring, whether in person or remotely, that we will be able to get valid and reliable results, that there are measures in place to ensure test security, and that it really shouldn't cost anything additional to what states are currently using in their test contracting. And states still have time to plan moving forward if they haven't taken steps so far. So in a short 1-minute summary, what should states or policymakers who are listening to this webinar do next?
I think that one of the biggest things is to check with the State Department of Education and make sure they have plans in place for spring, not just the initial plan, but also backup options in place. And if not, they need to start working on those.
Right. Any support that can be given to department in terms of more information, it's sometimes it's easy just to say, well, let's just not do that. And I think, now is the time where we need to step forward and push and say, no, now is the time for us to assess these students. And, parents want to know the information. The public wants to know the information. People are anxious to understand what the impact has been. And certainly the assessment is a huge and solid indicator for getting that information.
And I would just add that now more than ever is the time where you need information on students' strengths and needs. And now is kind of a critical time. And as Chairman Bobby Scott said, it's kind of a moral imperative to find out where our students are at and to try to help them going forward. So I think the need for information on our students' achievement, their losses, their gains, where they're at, is now more critical than it's ever been, and we can deliver that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I truly appreciate the three of you taking time out of your day to tell us what's possible for 2021 state summative assessments. To the attendees, I would like you to know that these sessions were recorded and will be available for the next 60 days. I would like to thank all the EdPalooza generous sponsors for actually making this conversation possible today. If you'd like to join the social media conversation, you can use hashtag EdPalooza. And for any more information on what you've heard today, please reach out to me or anyone else at ExcelinEd, and we'll be able to connect with you and get you what you need. We now have a 15-minute break, and our next sessions will begin at 4:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, thank you all for taking time to join us today.